iPredict works by gathering the knowledge of its 5,000 plus traders. If a stock has a price of 57 cents, that means the market thinks that event has a 57% chance of happening. If you agree, you buy. If you disagree, you short. And if you're right, you make money. Kia ora, good evening New Zealand. This is day 4 until the country goes to the polls. Welcome to iPredict Election 2011, the most accurate source of political and economic information in New Zealand broadcasting. Our 3 predictions tonight. Prediction 1, the market are predicting Greens at 11.5% party vote. Can they live up to the promise of double-digit support, or will they falter on the day? Prediction 2, iPredict is predicting 1.91% growth to the end of March 2012, while Treasury has predicted a bewilderingly optimistic 2.3%. What does Treasury know that the market doesn't? Prediction 3, the market are predicting 6.3% unemployment for March 2012 quarter, while Treasury say 5.8%. With global economic turmoil looming, is 6.3% a guilty buy? To dissect these predictions, let me introduce tonight's panel. He protested against China's visit by holding up a Tibetan flag and got roughed up by the Chinese Diplomatic Protection Squad, political activist and co-leader of the Greens, Dr. Russel Norman. And he is one of New Zealand's most respected and critical economists, editor of interest.co.nz, Bernard Hickey. Welcome to you both. We'll also wrap the show with a final prediction, but let's kick things off with tonight's first market prediction. The market are predicting Greens at 11.1% party vote, which, as a result, would give them their highest ever number of MPs. But what can greening the Parliament actually achieve? Russell, past the bike track that hasn't generated the job numbers John Key claimed it would, and past the insulation program, which seems like a continuation of a policy created with Labour. In the face of the environmental and social challenges we face, these achievements with National seem like small gains. What would a Green Labour government achieve as opposed to a Green-supported National government?
Well, I mean, if the Greens had the upper hand, and you know we were the majority party in a Green Labour government, then which is obviously quite a big ask, but
it's the dream of Liberals everywhere.
Yep, that's right. Then obviously around getting kids out of poverty, we'd move on that to immediately get 100,000 kids out of poverty and a whole bunch of other stuff around poverty.
What's the cost of that?
It's $300 million a year. We put out our fiscal projections about 2 months ago. You're welcome to go to part of our Green Jobs package. It's all costed there. And then around rivers, it'd be about getting some basic standards in place. Currently, if you look at a dairy operation, 90% of the nitrogen going through a dairy operation is currently unregulated because it's only the dairy shed that needs a resource consent. So we put a national policy statement for intensive agriculture so that we can actually get some controls on the pollution going through the system.
Cost per year?
Well, that in and of itself isn't a high cost per year, but we would also have a fund available for supporting riparian fencing and planting and fixing up, which would include that about $138 million a year.
Okay,
and there's a few other things around water. And then the Green Jobs package, which is a pretty broad package. We just announced one bit of it today, which is around changing the tax treatment for small and micro businesses to reduce compliance costs. But there's probably the biggest part of it, I guess, is about looking at the state-owned enterprises and using them as the basis for, if you like, an export industry in renewable electricity and energy technology. But there's a lot more to that package, which I'm happy to talk about at more length.
A rough cost per year for that?
Well, for that it doesn't really cost anything because it's about utilising the existing assets in a different way.
So you're talking $500 million a year, pretty much for the 3 essential planks of your policy?
Well, we've done when we've added it all up, over 3 years you're talking about $3.9 billion in terms of costs, and then in terms of revenue and cutting things that the government's currently doing, we'd be saving about 7.9 over 3 years. So
how much of that do you think you could get with Labour? How much do you think you could get with National?
Well, I guess what's happened since Labor's gone into opposition is that they've been kind of cannibalising our policy, which is great. Pity they didn't do it when we were in power. They basically opposed everything they now stand for. But anyway.
The lost decade, we like to refer to the 9 years.
It's like all the things we fought with them about, and they said, oh no, we can't extend money to the children of beneficiaries. That would be terrible. We must punish the children of beneficiaries in order to punish their parents for being immoral and not having a job. That was Labor's argument while they're in government. But now apparently they think that we should give beneficiary children support, so that's great. So we'll be able to get more of it through with Labor, no question about that.
Sure. Bernard, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change this week said that it was very likely that emission had led to an increase in daily temperatures, and that in turn increase the risk of extreme weather events. Can the Greens really challenge the power of the agricultural industry to force the political change necessary to future-proof our environmental economy?
Well, it will be fun to watch if we see if we see a national green, well, friendly arrangement, coalition, whatever you wanted to call it. This clash between farmers and particularly on this issue of intensification of dairying and the problems with nitrogen and with water, how that little tete-a-tete would pan out on the ninth floor or in some cabinet room, that would be fun to watch. Perhaps I need to leave a black velvet bag with a little microphone somewhere to watch that one work out.
Was it velvet, the bag? Was it? I didn't realise that.
Because, I mean, there was something in that. If you look at the power of the agricultural industry, I mean, there are suggestions that we were involved in the Iraq War for Fonterra's benefit. We were, of course, that very infamous report that came out, a 10-year report on the environment, that the dairy industry removed Chapter 13 from because it was critical of them. And, of course, most recently, we've got the suggestion that the state assets will be sold for $400 million worth of irrigation for South Island farming lobbyists. How are you going to be able to seriously strong-arm that industry?
Well, what we've done with the Land and Water Forum was the Land and Water Forum is a kind of three-legged beast, if you like. It's got iwi, it's got the industry, and it's got the greenies. And so what we said was we'll go into that provided we build public support for our corner of that. And so we were very, very active about running an external campaign around water quality issues while that Land and Water Forum was underway. And when you look at the surveys about what people think are the most important environmental issues, it's about water. When you ask them what's the cause of it, they say intensive agriculture. And when you ask them, well, would you like to get a bit of extra money from more intensive agriculture, which would degrade the rivers more, or would you rather protect the rivers? They say we'd like to protect the rivers. Yep. So in terms of public opinion, I think the public have come around and understand the issue.
I think that's
so,
too, but
so
how
our
do
job,
you get them?
Our job is to then, that's the base of our power, public opinion, and then we translate that into votes, and then we translate that into pressure. National themselves feel that pressure quite strongly. It's why they want to work with the Greens. It's for political reasons. National Party voters, a lot of them are quite environmentally minded. They care about waterways. And so it's all about political power and political pressure. So that's the approach.
Is that enough, Bernard? I mean, because the dairy industry is remarkably...
Oh, can I add one more thing before Bernard answers? And the other thing we've done over and over is we've said, look, our economy depends on our environment. New Zealand in particular is particularly vulnerable. And so any argument around the economy has to include how do you protect the environment as part of it, because that underpins our economy.
It's a great idea, but how does it work in practice?
Well, the power of the dairy lobby in Wellington is much stronger than I think a lot of people realise. And also, it's sort of foreign to New Zealand politics, this idea that we have corporate power in the halls of power. It's a very American idea. There is no K Street in New Zealand. But it is very influential, and particularly because of the strength of Fonterra and the strength of the relationship between the farm lobby, Federated Farmers, and National. And it's a traditional, relationship, perfectly understandable.
Like National and the Police Association.
Well, yeah. But
not as powerful.
Yeah, but certainly in this case, it's a tough one to unravel and to challenge. Because the farming lobby in New Zealand is very effective at making a noise, and we saw that through the whole fart tax campaign and the tractors on the steps of Parliament and all that.
Shane Ardern, wasn't it?
Yes, and so that would be a really interesting clash. But I think it's actually an issue which is resonating and actually is being talked about around kitchen tables and over bars in provincial New Zealand. I just spent a few days in Invercargill last week, where the hot topic for everyone is the Waituna Lagoon debate and what happens there with consents for land use. What does it mean for the intensification of Southland land use from, in many cases, less intense sheep farming to much more intense dairy farming? And also I think there's a strong point that the green side of any arrangement could make to a very corporate John Key, which is he's for brand New Zealand. He's the guy who goes overseas and gets beaten up by Stephen Sacker on Hard Talk about New Zealand's 100% pure. He doesn't like that stuff. He likes to see himself as representing a broad swathe of New Zealand opinion. And on this one, an awful lot of New Zealand opinion is saying
Supports
we've got
green.
some problems here and we
Yeah.
need to address them.
Yeah. Question of both of you. Winston Peters has blocked green aspirations for almost a decade. Does a resurgent New Zealand First threaten to crash green influence?
Well, I'd probably challenge your premise. So in 2005, Labor went with New Zealand First and United Future. And the thing was, New Zealand First didn't have anywhere else to go. They couldn't go with Don Brash, so
Yep.
I never accepted Labor's argument that they didn't have any choice. They
Yep.
had to go with Winston.
But it was convenient for Labor, wasn't it?
was
To
very
shut the Greens
convenient.
down.
Yeah. So it was convenient for Labor because they wanted to move further right, and so it was great reason. So they could say, "Oh, we can't have the Greenies because of Winston."
Yep.
But it's certainly true. I mean, Winston and the Greens, we have some policy that overlaps. To be fair, I mean, it's quite interesting. to
Economic
look at.
sovereignty.
Yeah,
Yep.
there is
Yep.
quite
Yep.
a lot there
Yep.
around economics. It's very interesting.
Yep.
But there's a whole bunch of areas where we're just like literally kind of from different generations.
Sure,
you know,
sure.
And that kind of comes through particularly on environmental
Most of the
issues.
crazy racist stuff.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, that
The
stuff, right.
anti-Asian, anti-Muslim stuff that
Yeah,
he did
yeah.
is just unbelievable.
It's another. It really is another age, isn't it? Do you think the economic sovereignty issues, though, could actually see Greens and New Zealand First agree a lot more?
Well, it'll be interesting, particularly around the Reserve Bank Act
Yep.
and the way that Labor have shifted a little bit towards changing that, and around ownership of land. There is some common views there, and often in tandem with a broad swathe of public opinion.
Sure.
So who knows? I mean, it all depends on the numbers after the night and
Yep.
who's got the whip hand, and
Yep.
there'll be some personality clashes and other things that go on there. But there are some common elements. Now, we're always
Will
surprised.
he be there though? Will he be there? That's the thing.
And
Is he going to get
I
five? I don't think
I
he's
didn't.
gonna
I
get
didn't
five.
want to write him off, but he just. John Key's complete blethering over the Epsom tape seems to have given all the oxygen he needs. God knows. At 11.1% party vote on iPredict, would you short it because the market have overinflated the Greens' electoral chances, or will you buy it because you think you get over 11.5?
I reckon we're going to get over 11.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I do think this
You
is
think
the
this
Greens
is-
election.
this is the
I
year?
think this is the time. I've been doing this for a while.
Sure, yeah,
And
yeah,
I've
yeah.
always been thinking we've got to get over 10. That's what we need to
Yep.
do. And if I'm co-leader of the party, that's my job.
Yep.
And I feel like this is the time.
Yeah, that's how
11.
you feel, but what's the evidence you've got?
Oh,
to
so
say
the
that?
evidence is strong polling over a long time. I mean, it's not just like it suddenly happened. Over a concerted period, the Greens are in a pretty strong position. I mean, we're strong, stable. I think we've run a pretty effective campaign. So yeah, I
What's
think
your
we're in a good
punt?
spot.
What's your punt?
Yeah, I think the polls are interesting,
Yep.
and I understand you've had some discussions about how the polls are done.
Yes,
Often
yes,
they're
yes,
to
yes,
landlines,
yes, yes.
and
We
they,
had Roy Morgan on yesterday.
and they
Yep.
miss out a big chunk of New
Yes.
Zealand, and it's even a bigger chunk of New Zealand than it was 3 years ago.
That's right.
Of people who don't have landlines, only have mobile phones, and even if they do get called on a landline, they're unlikely
That's
to talk.
right. That's right.
So who knows with polls? You never.
You
never
could be
know.
getting higher.
Yeah, that's
see?
right.
Thank you, panel. Let's move on to prediction 2. iPredict is predicting 1.91% growth to the end of March 2012, while Treasury has predicted a bewilderingly optimistic 2.3%. What does Treasury know that the market doesn't? Russell, the Super Committee in the US today
Nothing.
said that they couldn't find a way forward to cut debt, triggering a 240-point drop on the Dow, while Spanish and Italian debt costs soar and Greece implodes politically. If Chinese growth slows, how can we afford green and social costs with such global economic turmoil?
Well, I mean, there's no question that there are big external challenges to the New Zealand economy, and obviously the global economy is in real trouble. Nonetheless, our connection with Australia and China has helped us and will continue. I mean, it's not, we are, and that does help the New Zealand economy.
We're insulated.
To some degree, nobody's absolutely insulated. You
Yep.
can't be. But it has helped us. In terms of our kind of the green growth stuff, what I would argue is that internationally, what's the growth sector? There's a huge growth in clean energy, for example, renewable energy, and clean tech more generally. And so I think, actually it's a growth sector. Compared to the other sectors in the economy, it's looking good. The other side, the last thing, the other thing, of course, New Zealand's got going for it is it's a food producer.
Yep.
Being a food producer helps.
Yeah. Bernard, the New Zealand government financial statements for September 2011 quarter show a 4.2% drop in GST revenue, a 13.2% drop in individuals tax revenue, and a 3.2% drop in corporate tax revenue. if Treasury's black swans aren't all coming home to roost, they've at least booked ahead and paid a deposit, haven't they?
Yeah, that's a messy bunch of black swans.
That's a lot of black swans.
And there's a lot of mess on the ground.
Yeah,
when you have
yeah,
that
yeah.
many swans in one place.
We're in trouble, aren't we?
Well, the Treasury said 1 in 5 chance of a serious problem in
Yep.
Europe. We've certainly got that.
Yep.
And Bill English said 1 in 20 chance of a serious meltdown.
Yep.
What we've seen in the last week to 2 weeks is essentially a silent run on the European banking system with a withdrawal of about $250 billion of bonds by US money market funds and banks from European banks, and this essentially has been dumped in the lap of the European Central Bank, which is acting now as the borrower of last resort. The only thing stopping the European financial system from imploding is the European Central Bank. And
Isn't that
unfortunately,
a very terrifying
idea?
idea?
Terrifying idea. It's the same position that the US Federal Reserve was in 3 years ago, and it was the same position that the Bank of England was in 3 years ago, so now it's just transferred to the European Central Bank. Unfortunately, this time, in the United States and in Britain, they had single governments and single people in charge of their central bank. This time around in Europe, there are 17 countries in the Eurozone, and a big debate between the two biggest parties, France and Germany, about whether the European Central Bank does come to the rescue of Europe and prints money hand over fist to buy toxic Italian and Spanish bonds.
Yeah.
This again is another one of these by stealth bailouts of private sector bondholders and shareholders in banks. Because
so those people arguing 99% are getting screwed over, they've actually got a point?
Yeah, and particularly in Europe, where, can you believe this, youth unemployment in Spain is 46%. This is where Occupy Wall Street came from, actually, is they were inspired by the Los Indignados, the Spanish young people who camped in the squares protesting against austerity, and they've just elected a centre-right government which is about to do even more austerity.
Why? What happened there?
Demanded by essentially the Euro elite, the European Central Bank, the EU, saying the only way out of this is austerity. Of course, when you look at a whole economy, trying to use an austerity program in Europe is disastrous. We've already seen an action preview, which is in Greece. Same thing's happening in Italy, potentially in Spain, certainly in Portugal, and eventually you get to a point where the European Central Bank owns all this debt, and you go into a grinding debt spiral, recession, or worse in Europe.
It's like a black hole of debt, isn't it?
So the question for politicians, including Russell, if he manages to get into government, is what's your plan B? What are you going to do if it does go pear-shaped? On Monday morning, the new Prime Minister says, we're forming a coalition and we're going to do it all different because something happened over the weekend.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is looking at the debt position of the New Zealand government and trying to be as conservative as you can about it. And so, you know, that's why we've said, you know, the earthquake levy to pay for the rebuild rather than borrowing the money, so trying to reduce some of the exposure. In the long term, I mean, we are going to have to look at some, potentially, I mean, depending on what happens, some unorthodox measures around the Reserve Bank, just like they have in other places.
Printing money?
Well, obviously, it's not. You're not allowed to call it printing money, Bernard. You know that it's called quantitative easing. So the Bank of England didn't print money; it just had some quantitative easing.
It eased itself.
But I mean, you are going to have to look at unorthodox measures. We brought this up with the Governor of the Reserve Bank when he's been in front of the Finance and Expenditure Committee. He's obviously not very comfortable with quantitative easing. And, you know, but if New Zealand is in that position, then it'll have to be put on the table, like in every other country it's had to be put on the table.
And would you be comfortable doing the sort of quantitative easing that Britain and America have done, which essentially is hand a bunch of money to the banks and hope they spread it around, or do you print the money and use it to, like, build 10,000 state houses or something?
Well, I mean, we're lucky in New Zealand because we've got the model, the John A. Lee model of the, you know, of how they built the first round of state houses, which is essentially that the Reserve Bank printed money or quantitative easing. You know, and so one way to do it, the obvious way to do it if you were going to do it, was that the Reserve Bank would start to basically buy government debt. So in the process, a kind of quantitative easing, which would insulate the government from the international finance markets in terms of its debt servicing. Yep. Obviously, that isn't long-term sustainable. You can't keep doing that. But as a short-term measure, I'm sure the Reserve Bank's already given that quite a lot of thought.
Question to both of you. Do either of you seriously believe the budget can be in surplus by 2014, 2015?
I think it's a pretty tall order, given where we're at the moment.
Well, at the moment, particularly after the tax cuts last year, which are costing $2.5 billion or so, essentially in borrowed money.
Nice for some if you're supposed to be getting that tax cut.
I know,
Well,
borrowed money to give tax cuts.
How
to
outrageous
wealthy.
is
That
that?
is outrageous.
Yeah.
And with the, our emphasis now on GST to raise revenues, and the consumer sector, households are not spending as much as they were. Even with the Rugby World Cup, we're seeing very anemic growth in spending, even with credit cards. So that reliance on GST to raise funds in an anemic economy and having cut back your ability to raise funds from the wealthier means you're in a bit of trouble. And of course the spending constraints by government in the last 3 to 4 years are not nearly as much as you might have expected. And particularly when, this is a national government who were in theory going to slash and burn. They haven't done that yet.
They don't like to say that they're going to borrow more, but they are borrowing more.
Well,
Question to both of you. With the iPredict market saying 1.91% growth through the end of March 2012, would you buy because Treasury at 2.3% is correct, or hold because pessimism is the new normal?
Obviously, it's a pretty pessimistic.
It's pretty pessimistic.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to get angry about something, get angry about the fact that the government gave tax cuts to the top 10% alone cost $2 billion a year. We have to borrow an extra $2 billion a year in order to give tax cuts to the top 10%.
That's pretty abhorrent to New Zealand's egalitarianism.
And mostly from the home of communism, China.
I know. Oh, the irony. Thank you, panel. Moving on, prediction 3. The market are predicting 6.3% unemployment for March 2012 quarter, while Treasury say 5.8%. With global economic turmoil looming, is 6.3% a guilty buy? Bernard, the full impact of the 1929 stock market collapse wasn't felt until the mid-1930s. What will the social impact of this recession be, and is 6.3% unemployment unrealistic?
It's interesting, some of the structure of unemployment this time around is a bit different. I went through the 91-92 recession and was unemployed myself. When I was relatively young and attractive, but not anymore. Now, the weight of the recession is really falling hardest on the young. So youth unemployment more than 25% nationally, up towards 30% for Māori and Pacifica. And it's the same around the world. The youth are being hurt hardest in this recession. 46% in Spain. Our youth unemployment rate is not that much less than that in Egypt, which caused all sorts of grief. Now, there are other social issues and political issues there, but I'm sort of a bit stunned that our young are not as grumpy as they could be, knowing what's ahead of them, knowing that unless some changes are made, they face either higher taxes or enormous debts they're going to have to service and repay in 10, 20 years' time, unless those people in charge of policies at the moment actually start thinking longer than the next 3 or 4 days and actually start thinking 3 or 4 decades out when they're doing their economic planning.
Russell, with lowered quality of life, people get agitated. One person's middle-class vandalism is another's underclass activism. You made a name for yourself as a protester against China. Do you think the level of activism will increase if a re-elected National Party ran through more environmentally and socially damaging policy?
Yes.
Yes?
Yep.
And what support would you like to give that? Because obviously you've had your own sort of issue with the billboards. Were you disappointed there with some of your own activists?
Well, I mean, for me, the billboards is different to other things. I like the billboards because it's part of the democracy. It's very low entry. Any small political party can afford to put up billboards. Other people I know don't like them. They think they're messy. But for me, for 50 grand, you can communicate your message from the top of the country to the bottom to pretty much everyone, if you've got the volunteer activists, right? So I don't like seeing the billboards destroyed. That's why I was so annoyed about it. Aside from, anyway, so I don't think it's democratic. But I do think that more broadly that we are going to see a more of an activist response if National really goes on the rampage after the election. And I think that'll be good. I mean, why is it that we're not currently mining in national parks? Because New Zealanders got out on the streets and stopped it.
So will we see more activism from the Greens in Parliament post this election?
Well, activism in Parliament, I'm not quite sure how that goes together, but I think...
Well, you did a pretty good job of it, didn't you?
Okay, there's that one. But I mean, I think it's more that you're going to see activism outside Parliament, putting pressure on Parliament to say, hey, come on, you can't take this out on the poor, you can't take this out on the environment. Yes, we've got some economic challenges and fiscal challenges, but it shouldn't be the poor and the environment that have to suffer.
Question to both of you. If the market is predicting a higher unemployment rate than Treasury, where do all the beneficiaries National wish to send back to work supposed to find a job? Where do those mothers who have to go out to work now, the mentally ill or the sick, where do they get the jobs?
Well, there aren't the jobs in the formal workplace, and I actually think we need to think a bit more differently about work and paid work, and in a future where it seems many companies essentially look to cut costs and remove the largest number of people as they can, use more machines, drive up productivity, you end up in that model with a lot of people who are not working for money.
Right.
So maybe you have to find some other ways to pay them that it doesn't involve paying them from a company or for a government, and actually rewarding work that is not paid work in the formal corporate or government sector. There's an awful lot of work being done in community groups and in social spaces, which are not rewarded, and are not understood, not even counted in the stats. So I actually think in the next, I try to avoid thinking the next 6 months, 12 months, because who knows, but longer term trends are that society looks more to each other and to communities than they do to corporate and governmental structures to try and get this stuff done. That's a bit sort of airy-fairy long-term thinking, but actually I think it's important. And when you look at the most interesting movement in the world right now, which is Occupy Wall Street, a lot of these things are being talked about.
Sure. Where are they supposed to find these jobs in the 6.3% unemployment environment?
Well, obviously it's difficult. That's why we've made, our third priority is green jobs, and we put out a green jobs package. Part of the green jobs package is about making sure there's jobs that are particularly aimed at young people, and there's some semi-skilled jobs in there as well. So the home insulation scheme fits into that, riparian fencing and planting fits into that, particularly for rural and Māori communities. So we've tried to have it across the board. There's kind of high-end jobs, but there's also, if you like, some kind of low, some entry-level jobs.
Sure. At 6.3% on the iPredict market, are you suggesting unemployment is going to be higher or lower?
It's likely to be higher because of what we're seeing in the rest of the world. But actually the more important bit is the bit underneath, which is the youth unemployment.
Sure.
That is where all the effort should be focused, I think, and where people should be watching. And the number that's at the top of the front page when we report these numbers should not be 6.3 or 4 or 5. It should be 29.5 or 28.5, which is particularly in Auckland, youth and Māori unemployment, and nationally, that range of the 15 to 19-year-old range.
6.3% unemployment next year. Your thoughts?
Well, if things turn pear-shaped internationally, then obviously there's upward pressure on those numbers. But, I agree with Bernard. That's why we specifically designed a jobs package that would try to deal with that.
Yeah. Thank you, panel. Let's wrap the show with final prediction. Bernard, your final prediction this evening is?
Here we go. Greens, 15% or more.
Wow! That's a huge goal.
Just to throw it out there. Mainly because we've got a poll on our site we put up. And currently, maybe it's because of our audience, but they're doing well more than that at the moment.
Wow, congratulations.
We'll see.
Russell, your final prediction tonight?
I'm with Bernard.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Bernard. To my final prediction. So the worm turned last night on the TV3 leaders debate and apparently supports an egalitarian redistributive tax system. Phil Goff, aka the Worm Rider, had massive support every time he opened his mouth, while a rattle Key had the worm crawling so low I concluded the worm was secretly a socialist. Key is great in front of crowds and thrives on the celebrity, but in a sterile TV studio with no vibe, he looked as out of touch as Paul Henry did when he called the debate for Key. I'm still shorting National at 45% party vote. On the panel tomorrow night, I'm joined by Mike Williams and Matthew Hooton. Follow me on my Citizen Bomber and Twitter, Facebook accounts for all my latest election updates. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again tomorrow, 7 p.m. for iPredict Election 2011, exclusively on Stratus TV. Until then, get trading.